I am no more pro-Palestinian than I am anti-Israeli. I am pro-human rights and anti-oppression. I claim that is neither territorial, political, ideological, religious, or cultural in nature at its root. At its root, it is a psycho-spiritual problem. I was always a big defender of Israel all my life. And then I saw this book by a guy named Norman Finkelstein. And the name of the book was Beyond Chutzpah, on the misuse of anti-Semitism and the abuse of history. Quickly, I started reading the book. I swear to God, the first thing I noticed when I picked up that book and opened it to the very first page was that within 2 sentences, I said to myself, this guy is brilliant. The fact that I concluded so quickly that Finkelstein was brilliant kept me reading the book. So then the anger towards myself turned into shame and embarrassment at how I had been part of this class of people who had demonized these innocent people. I thought to myself, I need to take a break. So I put the book down and closed my eyes. And I really don't know how long my eyes were closed. But when I opened them, I noticed something very strange. I felt totally cleansed of any negative emotion. Wonderful, wonderful, warm feeling of peace. I reclaimed my humanity with all people.
Welcome back to Book Club on Palestine, to our next chapter in Beyond Tribal Loyalties. And today we're very fortunate and pleased and delighted to welcome Rich Fora, who will share his chapter with us. His chapter is called A Startling Awareness. And welcome, Richard. Welcome, Rich. Please, the floor is yours.
Okay. Well, let me preface my remarks by stating up front that I am no more pro-Palestinian than I am anti-Israeli. I am pro-human rights and anti-oppression. If the roles of the Palestinians and Israelis were reversed and I were pro-Palestinian, I would be supporting war crimes and crimes against humanity. So I just wanted to make that point up front because I see it all the time on the news. They always refer to someone who believes in equal rights for Palestinians as pro-Palestinian. No, most of those people believe in equal rights for Israeli Jews also, and they would be supporting their quest for equal rights if they were being oppressed. Okay, so I want to point out that, when you hear, over the years, I've heard occasionally, it doesn't happen very often, but occasionally I'll see an interview with someone or someone will write about the root cause of the Israel-Palestine issue. And I never hear a satisfactory answer. I hear the root cause is settler colonialism, the Nakba, the Holocaust, anti-Semitism, and various other similar issues. I claim that the issue, first of all, is neither territorial, political, ideological, religious, or cultural in nature at its root. At its root it is a psycho-spiritual problem. And by psycho-spiritual, I mean the mind or ego and its defenses and identity. And what I mean by identity is our attachment to particular identities. And this attachment to particular identities forces us to see the world through the prism or the lens of that identity. If we see ourselves...
Rich, I'm jumping in for a second. For the benefit of those who haven't had the chance to read the chapter, do you mind just introducing yourself a little bit?
Oh, okay. Sorry. Okay. My name is Rich Fora.
Yeah.
Okay. My name is Rich Fora. I was brought up in New Jersey in the United States in a pretty large Jewish community. I was always a big defender of Israel all my life. I never called myself a Zionist. No one that I grew up with used the term Zionist, but we all believed in the state of Israel because as Jews, we believed that Jews needed a haven from anti-Semitism. So my support for the state of Israel wasn't because I had a Zionist ideology. It was because I was Jewish and I wanted safety for my people, okay? When I was 58 years old in 2006, and I'm not going to go into all the details, they're in my book, in my books especially, that you can find on Amazon, but In 2006, you may remember that Hezbollah conducted a cross-border raid into northern Israel and killed, I think, 2 Israeli soldiers and abducted 3. And that was horrifying to me. And it was what made it even more horrifying than it would have been had it been a lone event, was that 3 weeks earlier, Hamas had captured Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit on the Israel-Gaza border. And so I saw this combination of events as proof in my mind as a Jew who identified as a person who much of the world hated. I saw this confluence of events as proof that the Arab world would not rest until Israel wiped the Jews from the face of the earth. I saw myself being a Jew. I knew, well, if I had been on the Gaza border, they would have kidnapped me. I'm just as much an enemy to them as Gilad Shalit. I'm just as much as an enemy to them as the soldiers they killed and abducted in northern Israel. So that began that abduction, and Israel's response the next day began what they called the Second Lebanon War. And I was very troubled by that. And so what I decided to do was I decided to speak to 2 of my wisest friends. Neither of them was Jewish. And I knew that they had been critical of Israel in the past. But this time I thought, well, obviously they're going to agree with me now, finally, after what happened with Gilad Shalit and with Hezbollah's cross-border raid. And so I spoke to each of them individually. And to my utter surprise, neither of them agreed with me. They both blamed, and they were not talking together, but they both blamed that Israel was responsible for killing lots of innocent civilians and displacing 1 million people. So I felt totally demoralized by this. So I went home and I thought about each conversation. I thought about my conversation with one of my friends, and then I thought about my conversation with the other. And I could not, I wanted to see if there was something I had missed, something that I had misunderstood, and I couldn't find anything. And so I concluded that only Jews can understand the suffering of our people. So then what happened was, a few days later, the war is raging, and I get a very unexpected phone call from an old friend in New Jersey. I was living in New Mexico at the time, and my friend Sammy was calling. He never calls. But he called to tell me he was coming out west and was going to stop in and see me for a week. I said, Sammy, that's great. And by the way, the Arab world wants to kill all the Jews. And I went on, I swear to God, I went on for at least 2 hours in this diatribe. Now, while I was talking to Sammy, I knew that he had studied the issue for many years. He had read books on it for many years, but he rarely talked about it, and he was very calm about it. I knew that I kind of knew that he was critical of Israel, but it wasn't obvious. Anyway, so I went on and on for at least 2 hours, and he only stopped me a couple times, very briefly, to correct me on, for example, a little historical fact that was not threatening to me. And at a certain point, he goes, why don't you read books by Tanya Reinhardt and Baruch Kimmerling? They're 2 well-regarded Israeli professors, Israeli Jewish professors. And then I thought to myself, now remember, he had not resisted my 2 hours of diatribe. And because he had not resisted, I realized this afterwards, it was as if he gave me the space to contemplate the possibility that there might be something I was missing. I had never studied anything. The only thing I had ever done prior to this conversation was read Joan Peters' piece of propaganda trash, to quote some of the Israeli Zionist scholars in Israel, Joan Peters' book From Time Immemorial, that claimed the Palestinian people did not exist. They were Arabs from other parts of the Middle East who came to Palestine and then Israel to get better jobs from Jewish landholders. Anyway, so Sammy goes, why don't you read these books by Tanya Reinhardt and Baruch Kimmerling? And I thought to myself, you know what? Maybe there's something I don't know. I actually thought that. And I said, all right. And so we concluded the conversation, and I went to my library. And when I got to the library, I looked up books on Amazon on the history of Israel-Palestine. And I saw many, many authors, including Tanya Reinhardt and Baruch Kimmerling. And I immediately, quickly eliminated anyone who wasn't Jewish. Any author who wasn't Jewish, forget about it. They could be an anti-Semite. So then I started looking in the halls of the library for some of these books. And I found one book I didn't find anything by Tanya Reinhardt. I found one book by Baruch Kimmerling. And then I saw this book by a guy named Norman Finkelstein. And the name of the book was Beyond Chutzpah, on the misuse of anti-Semitism and the abuse of history. I had not heard of Finkelstein up to that point. However, looking backward, I remembered, not at that moment, but a month or two later, I remembered that years before I had this conversation with Sammy during the Second Lebanon War, Sammy had told me that From Time Immemorial by Joan Peters had been debunked by a New York Jewish scholar whose name he couldn't remember. And that scholar was Norman Finkelstein. And when Sammy told me that, I immediately dismissed what he said. Oh, the guy must be a self-hating Jew, because I loved Joan Peters' book. It was like my Bible. Anytime someone would say something negative about Israel, I would sort of refute what they were saying with something I had read in Joan Peters' book. So I see this book, Beyond Chutzpah, on the misuse of anti-Semitism and the abuse of history. And I thought, well, let me look at the book jacket. So I looked at the book jacket, and it immediately says that Beyond Chutzpah was a repudiation of Alan Dershowitz's autobiography, or not autobiography, Alan Dershowitz's book, The Case for Israel. Dershowitz was another one of my Jewish heroes at that point. I loved Dershowitz because I loved hearing his legal analyses of things. And at the time, whenever I would hear him speak, he was left-wing. He was a liberal Jewish New Yorker and progressive. So I liked Dershowitz. So I'm saying, oh my God, this guy's criticizing Dershowitz? Geez. And then I keep reading, and then the book jacket mentions Joan Peters and how Joan Peters' book had been debunked. And I'm thinking, oh, I don't want to read this stuff. But then it occurred to me, you know what? These are two of my heroes, kind of. I'll always have some doubt if I don't take this book out. So I better check the book out. So I did. Subsequently, I started reading the book. And while I was reading it, I noticed that there was, well, first of all, the first thing I noticed, I swear to God, the first thing I noticed when I picked up that book and opened it to the very first page was that within 2 sentences, I said to myself, this guy is brilliant. Now, normally, the only time in my life I ever read anything where I could make that determination that someone was brilliant was in the 1970s when I read Nikos Kazantzakis' book, The Last Temptation of Christ. That book won him the Nobel Prize. And the first sentence, when I read the first sentence, somehow I knew that Kazantzakis was brilliant and the book would be a brilliant book. And I was right. Anyway, the fact that I concluded so quickly that Finkelstein was brilliant kept me reading the book, because there was nothing he said that was negative about the Palestinians. He's going on and on and on about crimes or policies of the Israelis that were inhumane, and documenting everything very meticulously. And I'm going, well, when's he going to start talking about the crimes of the Palestinians? And I'm thinking, well, I got to check his sources out. He footnoted everything. So I would check out B'Tselem, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International. I would look at his citations, and then I would go to the report he cited, and I would look for the exact clause. And my hope was that I would find him either taking quotes out of context in order to demonize the Israelis, or maybe misplace a word here or there to present a completely different version of what the report was actually saying. But unfortunately, he was totally impeccable. Everything he quoted was exactly as I saw it in the reports. So reading all this stuff and reading all these horrible things that the Israelis were doing to the Palestinians, I went through a series of emotions. But as I went through this series of emotions without any resistance, because I was so absorbed in what I was reading. And so what happened was I was shocked. Israel is doing this to these poor people? Israel is acting so brutally. And then the shock turned to anger at what Israel was doing. They have no right doing this to these people. They have no right using lethal force when there's unarmed children and adults around who are not presenting any threat. They have no right destroying people's houses, sometimes with people inside, just because they're Palestinian. And then the anger turned in on myself for being such a dupe all my life. Now, a lot of people say to me, well, oh, come on, you were in the middle of the first book you ever read. How can you make all these determinations? I have no idea. I have no idea, but it was sort of, all I can say, it was meant to be, as you'll find out in a minute. So then the anger towards myself turned into shame and embarrassment at how I had been part of this class of people who had demonized these innocent people. Yes, there were some quote, terrorists, but they were a small segment of the Palestinian population. And most of the people were innocent people who just wanted to live their lives, but whose lands and homes were being stolen and destroyed. So then I thought to myself, I need to take a break. So I put the book down and closed my eyes. And I really don't know how long my eyes were closed. But when I opened them, I noticed something very strange. I felt totally cleansed of any negative emotion. The feeling was also not only that I felt cleansed, I felt blissful. And I'll describe what I mean by blissful in a minute. It's not how most people take the word blissful, but I felt, in other words, I didn't feel joyous. I felt free. And I had the sense of wonderment. I thought, where's the anger? Where's the shame and the embarrassment? Where's the shock? And the distinction between the new state and the previous state was so stark that I just spontaneously began looking around in my room. I looked in my bookcase and in the corners of my walls. Where's the shock? Where's the shame? Where's the anger? And I couldn't find any hint of any of that. So I decided, well, let me just sit back and bask in this feeling of freedom and wonderment. And I just sat down. And then a series of events happened. I'll go quickly through these, but I explain them in a little more detail in my books. But at a certain point, I felt this wonderful, wonderful, warm feeling of peace. That's the word that came up. It wasn't like I was trying to figure out what I was feeling. Peace is the word that came to my mind. And this wonderful feeling of peace, I saw that the world is a projection of my inner states of consciousness. And if I am peaceful inside, the world would reflect my peace. In other words, the world is a projection. The world itself is empty. And we project onto the world our beliefs and images. So, for example, if I see myself as a victim, then I will always, if that's my identity, that is my ego identity, I will always interpret things that happen in the world through the filter, through the lens of that identity. I will always reinforce and validate that identity, because I don't want to say because threats to that identity are experienced as mortal by the unconscious mind. They are mortal threats. Just as when someone tells me something about how the Palestinians are always trying to kill the Jews, and they may say something which is false, like, well, the partition plan, the Jews accepted the partition plan in 1947. Well, that's all they know, one sentence. The Jews accepted the partition plan. The fact is, and I want to be quick about this, but the Arab world had offered a full democratic single state for everybody that the Jews rejected. Everybody knew, including the Arabs, that the Jews had no intention of honoring partition. They'd been talking about it for a decade. David Ben-Gurion, Chaim Weizmann, Menachem Begin, they talked about how they would use the partition of the Jewish state as a stepping stone to expand into the whole of Palestine. Quote from David Ben-Gurion. Okay, so back to my story. So after this feeling of peace arose, I was just sitting there, just totally mindless, really. And I felt this beautiful, I should say, very comfortable and soothing, like, veil covering my eyes with a little bit of pressure on my eyes that felt good. And I just sat there noticing it without any judgment. And then all of a sudden the veil started unraveling from left to right. and it uncovered one eye and then the other eye. And then I noticed I was free. And then I said, well, I couldn't find, by free, I meant I could not find a separate identity. I couldn't find a Jewish identity somehow. And I thought, where's my Jewish identity? Maybe I should test myself and animate it. So I imagined myself, I had two imaginations that I did. First, this was in 2006. This was 3 years after the United States had invaded Iraq. And I remembered how during that invasion, subsequently, ISIS of Iraq, or whatever they called themselves at the time, had captured a young Jewish man who was 23 years old by the name of Nick Berg. And they had shown him on TV with the British ISIS guy who was covered with his saber against Nick Berg's neck. On TV, they didn't show him beheading him, but that's what he did, or he sliced his throat and killed him. And I remember that, and I was horrified. And I was always horrified whenever I read about attacks by Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda of Iraq against anybody, but especially Jews, because I could see myself in the place of Jews. So I imagined myself in the place of Nick Berg. I made it as graphic as possible, and I imagined myself seeing these, quote, terrorists murdering little Jewish children. And what happened was, instead of any feeling of terror or fear arising, what arose was the realization that everybody craves the same right despite the horrible things people may do. Everybody craves the same right to self-determination as anybody else. And when I recognized that, somehow I realized that I had forfeited my humanity in all my life, demonizing the Palestinian people and seeing them as a group of terrorists who hated Jews. And I never saw myself as I never saw myself as a bigot. I didn't think I was bigoted. I had met Palestinians who were nice, who I liked. But I just thought the Palestinian society in general was psychopathic and murderous. That's what I actually believed, and a lot of people believe that. Anyway, so when I recognized that I had lost my humanity with all people, I reclaimed my humanity with all people. And at that moment, this feeling arose from the ground up through my legs, through my feet, all the way up through my body. And somehow I recognized it as equanimity. And I realized that I was as much Israeli or Palestinian as American or Jew or Buddhist or Muslim or Christian. And then all these insights came. So I'm not going to go into all the insights, but I realized I had to write a book, and I had never done such a thing. And to tell you the truth, had I known how difficult it is to write a book, I never would have done it. It's a lot of work. Anyway, so my point is that how much time? We got plenty of time. Okay. My point is that for me at one time, probably Abigail at one time, and certainly for everybody who still supports Israel, the real issue is not Israel versus the Palestinian people or Israel versus a hostile world. The real issue is the inability or refusal or unwillingness to integrate the ideas they have, to integrate their the real issue is the fear of integrating the awareness, really the inescapable awareness of Israel's treatment of Palestinians with their unquestioned loyalty to the Jewish state. One impulse recognizes Israel's dark side. The other impulse denies that the dark side exists because it denies their own dark side. Okay? Now, I claim that I have never met someone who defends Israel who gives a damn about Israel. They don't care about Israel. What they care about is defending their self-imagery, their identity. Okay? They don't even see the real Israel. What they see is the Israel that is projected from their mind, the idealist that projects their mind projects idealistic images onto the real Israel. So what they see is an Israel that only exists in the collective mind of Israel's supporters. They cannot face the fact of what Israel's doing. So I'm sure anyone who's spent time on Facebook or social networks has seen, like I have seen lots of comments by people who defend Israel, whether they're Jewish Israelis or American Jews or non-Jews who are Zionists, talking about how Hamas or Palestinian terrorists want to murder all the Jews and how terrorism is the problem. They go on and on, but do you ever see them mentioning or even responding like I write to them and they don't respond? Well, what about the torture? What about what Itamar Ben-Gvir loves for Israel to do? What about the fact that so many people are viciously and brutally raped and tortured, and many of them have been tortured to death? What about that? And what about the 20,000 children in Gaza who've been killed and the more than 2,000 soldiers bragging about murdering little kids? Does any of that make a difference? And you know what? It doesn't make a difference. We're defending ourselves. So again, what I'm saying is that this is a psycho-spiritual problem because the real issue is self-imagery. And so my definition of the root of the problem is the attachment to a presumed, limited, and mortal identity, and I emphasize the word mortal, and to the beliefs and images that emanate from and reinforce and perpetuate that presumption. Okay? And the reason I emphasize mortal is because when I challenge someone with facts, and I know a lot of facts, and when I challenge someone's repetition of Israeli Hasbara and show that what they're talking about, they don't know what they're talking about, they're totally wrong, and it's the opposite of what they believe, they become very angry. In fact, I've seen Zionists get far more angry about this issue than Palestinians I know who've had their entire families wiped out. So they get very angry because, unbeknownst to them, they're feeling threatened. They're feeling like they are mortally threatened, okay? Because their self-imagery is being challenged. They see themselves as fair and humane. A fair and humane person will not support a country that is unfair and inhumane. And this is what I mean when they project their idealistic images onto the real Israel. They're projecting fairness and humanity onto Israel. They cannot conceive, just like I could not conceive prior to 2006, that Israel would ever treat people inhumanely. They're the Jewish state, right? So this is the dynamic that's going on. And the problem is that because it's a matter of identity, or ego or self-imagery, people will defend that ego, that imagery, with all they have. It's a life or death situation to them. And so this brings me to, I don't know how much more time I have. I guess I have a few more minutes. I just want to mention anti-Semitism because, you often hear people defending themselves. Well, just because I criticize Israel for what they're doing to the Palestinians doesn't make me an anti-Semite. And then you hear Netanyahu and all these other people saying you are an anti-Semite if you criticize Zionism.
Reach 2 minutes.
Okay. All right. So what I want to point out quickly is that what the real issue about anti-Semitism is not anti-Semitism, it's the accusations of anti-Semitism. Because those people who weaponize the anti-Semitism label to silence critics, they're doing it as a way of projecting their bigotry onto the other and as a way of denying their own bigotry. So they're making us, those of us who criticize Israel, they're making us into them, and then they're criticizing us, not knowing that what they're criticizing really is their own mind. So so in other words, their belief in what Israel tells them is a way to retain their unexamined identity and to avoid looking in the mirror. So most of these accusations, almost all of them, are projections. So another way of putting this is the actual bigotry occupies the minds of those who are afraid to ask why someone is critical of Israel. They reflexively accuse me of anti-Semitism as soon as I criticize Israel without knowing who I am. And so their indifference to the suffering of an entire people and their refusal to do honest research, to discover what's true and is not true, is an element of their not only their bigotry towards Palestinians, but of their accusations against me, because they're abdicating responsibility for their own feelings of fear and confusion and anger. So they project them onto those of us who are objects that they can project onto. Okay. This is how they maintain their fragile sense of self. My final thing, I'll say one more sentence and then we'll go to the question and answer. I just want to mention that the real enemy is not someone or something outside of us. The real enemy is the unexamined mind that projects its suffering onto the other and then blames and scapegoats the other for its suffering. This is what's going on. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Rich. This is a fascinating angle, and you know, I wish you could speak for a whole hour, but we don't have it. So thank you so much for what you offered. A couple of very quick comments. You mentioned that the shock you felt, the anger against yourself, and then it turned to shame for being duped when you read Finkelstein. And then you said that you suddenly felt cleansed and free and feeling, having a feeling of wonderment. And it occurred to me that when we become aligned with our actual values as people and we stop living with that dissonance that that was inflicted on us by our given identity that was given to us, we didn't choose it, it automatically leads to freedom and clarity because you're now aligned with yourself. You're no longer lying to yourself.
What I want to say is that earlier I said that I had this feeling of bliss, and it wasn't like most people think of bliss. What it was the freedom of no longer having the dilemma of a separate self that has to defend itself against anything that is outside its frame of reference. So this freedom was the freedom of, how do I put it, of my common humanity with all people. I didn't have to judge or use any concepts to tell myself what some people are like and other people are like. I was just free to be without any prejudice, without any images of one thing or another. I no longer had anything to defend.
And when we are conditioned to be Jewish, we are excluded from the rest of humanity. We were conditioned, Rich, and you know this, to forfeit our humanity for the loyalty to the tribe. And that's why this book is called Beyond Tribal Loyalty. And that's what I've been feeling so grateful. I was so grateful that you agreed to write for it, because that's exactly what happened to you.